History is the interpretation of the significance that the past has for us, and everyone in the world has a slightly different interpretation of our world. The more interpretations we gather, the easier it becomes to gain a sense of the whole. Today we are going to do a deep dissection of rocks and God Valley, specifically chapter 957 and what was told to us by Sengoku. I want to dispel the rumors around rocks that he was not erased like God Valley was, and maybe even more importantly that the characterization that people have accepted based off of what was told to us about rocks may not be accurate. I'm not saying rocks isn't evil, but what I am saying is chapter 957 doesn't exactly paint that picture to me, and I have interacted with a lot of creators and viewers who have a very different or boxed in interpretation of what was portrayed based on the dialogue in that chapter. So I'm here to clear the fog around God Valley and shine some of my insight on Rox D. Xebec, one of the most mysterious figures in One Piece. So if you're new to the channel, the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the Parvision. Let's take it from the top here. We get an introduction into the rock subject not through Sengoku, it was actually through Fujitora. When Akainu informed Fujitora that Kaido and Big Mom are forming an alliance, his reaction was, "My word, it's the return of rocks." So Fujitora is aware of rocks, and Akainu responds, "You don't need to speak of it like some legend, it's all reality." All of this kind of already insinuating that the information around rocks shouldn't be regarded with the air of legends, and more as a matter of fact. But that serves as a transition to another part of Marine HQ where Commodore Bernu is briefing us about the impending alliance between the two emperors. He says we have far too few details about this legendary Rocks pirate crew. Sengoku adds some dialogue and says seems like more than a few of our soldiers have never even heard of Rocks these days. He then goes on to say that Rocks was a group that came together on Pirate Island of Full of Lead that included Captain Rocks, Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido. The listening Marines were aghast at this revelation, and Sengoku adds that Shiki the Golden Lion, Silver Axe, Captain Jean, and Wang Ji were all big names who are also on the crew. Then the Marines, being debriefed, reacted by saying this can't be real. How can something this huge be lost to history? And so Sengoku responds to this question saying, well, they got along so terribly, not one of them actually wants to tell the tale. So let's pause here because this is a huge point of contention. The understanding that I've heard from a lot of people is that Rocks was so dangerous that he was erased from history along with God Valley. But I believe the two are separate. God Valley was said to have vanished without a trace and was an island that the world government wanted to hide, and it disappeared entirely. But this is not the fate that Rocks suffered. The main difference that we can gather from the chapter, which we will go back to review, is that when God Valley was even mentioned, the conversation was shut down immediately. But when Rocks was inquired about, Sengoku explained plenty about what he knew of Rocks D. Xebec. If the world government was hiding Rocks on the same level as God Valley, why would Sengoku, the previous fleet admiral, be so willing to divulge the man who was erased? The answer is because he was not erased. He simply got lost in history. Why? Because no one actually wants to tell his tale. This is what Sengoku said, but let's go back to Kaido's dialogue in Onigashima. He said Whitebeard and Roger were the ones who died correctly because people tell their tales, but he does not mention Rocks. He even tells Luffy and Odin that when they die, their tales will be told, unlike Rocks, and that goes back to what Sengoku says here. None of the pirates, even on Rocks' side, wanted to tell his tale. We don't know why, but at the minimum, it's something that Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, and any Rocks pirate, including Bakans, does not tell tales of. Something like this leads me to extrapolate that it's something embarrassing, a story that no one wants to be a part of. Think about it. Kaido the 1v1 god, Whitebeard the strongest man, Big Mom, Shiki, and the rest all underneath Rocks ended up losing to what? A rookie upstart Roger and Garp? That's pretty embarrassing. I mean, let's look at the reaction at Rocks' own island in Kaido's flashback. What kind of joke is this? With all the monsters they've got, apparently it was a sailor named Garp who did it. Like, Garp wasn't even a known person at the time, and yet all of these monsters lost. That is embarrassing. Imagine having the dream team and losing because of no teamwork, supposedly. Regardless of the context, we can gather that the story is embarrassing for the Rocks pirates, but there's two sides to every story. Though we don't have Roger's account of the story, which probably would have been the most accurate, accurate, let's go back to chapter 957 real quick, or rather what Sengoku knows of the event from Garp, because he wasn't actually there himself, which we will talk about later. But let's just go quickly to Garp's part of this chapter, and then we'll go back to Rocks. But here is what Sengoku says. The Rocks pirates, the strongest crew in the world, were wiped out at an island called God Valley, according to the news reports. Now, we don't know if this was Big News Morgan's, but we do know from his Viver card that he is older than Perospero, who is 50, and old enough to call him Perospero-kun, which could imply that God Valley was covered by Big News Morgan's, who just got caught twisting the headlines for the sake of entertainment. So this was the news reported. And we know these headlines don't exactly tell us the truth, but then it goes on to say, a rampaging force of evil that none had been able to stop had been taken down by a Marine Vice Admiral by the name of Garp. His name was heard across the world, and he was soon called a hero of the Marines. Then the Marines reacted, so that's how the name started? So the news reports of God Valley is what created the name Hero of the Marines. But again, we aren't even sure of the context because we know how twisted the news reports can be. But anyways, Sengoku goes on to say Garp never wants to talk about God Valley. The first reason, which was never reported, was because Garp had to work with pirates who was Roger, which is crazy because that means that the news was so skewed that it reported that Garp soloed the Rocks pirates and Roger wasn't even mentioned there. And the second reason, which might have been reported, was that he was protecting Celestial Dragons from the Rocks pirates. And we get back to where we were before, in that in all of the surprise, the Marines being briefed say Celestial Dragons, Roger, and Rocks together? What exactly happened there? I've never even heard of a place called God Valley. Sengoku responds, that's because you won't find any map featuring an island called God Valley. As a matter of fact, God Valley itself vanished without a trace. The island that the world government wanted to hide disappeared entirely, and Sengoku cuts off any more line of questioning around God Valley, specifically asking, do you still want to hear more about it? But then continuing to talk more about Rocks himself, which we will get to. But let's now pause right here again and really synthesize what we just covered. Rocks was not erased. After God Valley, there's two main reasons why it feels like he is. One, no one who came out of God Valley with first-hand experience apparently want to ever talk about God Valley. The Rocks pirates are too embarrassed, and Garp is not proud of that event for some reason. The second main reason is that Rocks himself is said to be no longer alive to speak his own tales, and that is the most important thing here. Rocks left the story 38 years ago. All that was reported in the news here was the Rocks pirates, not individuals. And what's also important is that Rocks was reported in the news in regards to God Valley. Why post an article if you wanted to erase this man and the island? But on top of that, if the Rocks pirates were wiped out and never were active again, why would anyone really even know about them in our timeline? I mean, look what happened to Luffy and his crew after the time skip. It had only been 2 years. To the world, Luffy was dead and he vanished and only came back in notoriety because of Tomorrow Black. Imagine if 38 years went by after Luffy hypothetically died. Of course, no one would talk about Luffy despite all of the crazy things that he did. And that's probably the same thing for Rocks, and there's even more reason to that. Whereas God Valley was actually erased from the maps in a fashion that we can compare to Leloucia. Again, it was specifically God Valley that vanished without a trace, not Rocks. And you're probably asking, wasn't Rocks erased along with God Valley? But let's think about why that doesn't make sense, assuming if what happened to Leloucia happened to God Valley. In chapter 1060, we see what happened to Leloucia, but let's talk about what was communicated here. It seems like just like God Valley, Leloucia is now gonna be erased from the map. But how is Leloucia being erased? Well, it looked like it's destroyed, it'll be wiped off the map, and the witnesses tapping into a communication from Leloucia are ordered by the Gorosei to act like they did not detect anything and that the country never existed in the first place. This is the directive of the world government within all of their factions underneath their umbrella, to operate as if Leloucia doesn't exist. Now, something to dispel is the effect of this beam. See, it seems that some are under the interpretation that this beam also has a memory wiping effect. I mean, how else are they going to erase Leloucia? People know about about this nation. They are a part of the world government. So if people weren't mind wiped of it, then why act like it's disappeared? So it would make sense if there is some kind of mind wipe ability. But the thing is, if it did, then why even tell the communications team to forget and act like Lelucia never existed? Surely if the laser mind wipe people, that wouldn't be necessary. I mean, even Lucci mentioned Lelucia after all of this. So we can assume that the means of Lelucia to be erased from history is simply by deleting it off the face of the planet, which is insane, and making the mention of it thereafter is taboo. And all of that aside, at the moment, if we assume that this is how God Valley was also erased by the notion that people are still aware of God Valley existing at one point, like I'm sure many are of Lelucia, but it vanished in the same fashion, then here's the thing. It could not have been deleted like this during the events of God Valley. It had to have been after. Why? Because why would the world government want people to witness this kind of event? Sengoku said it vanished without a trace. Well, it wouldn't have mysteriously disappeared if people witnessed it being lasered from heaven like this. It also makes no sense to me right now that any of the people there saw this. Though maybe Kaido, Big Mom, Rocks Pirates, Roger Pirates, and Garp could maybe witness this and explains why they acted the way they did, but there were random Marines with Garp in the background. It makes more sense that whatever event transpired, completed through, then news was distributed, and sometime after, God Valley was then lasered away, making it so that in the last 38 years, no one ever made it there and was thereafter erased from the maps. Time playing the most pivotal role in the quote erasure of God Valley, and Rocks, emphasizing that the thing that the world government wanted to erase was God Valley and not Rocks. But you're probably like, wait, the government also covered up Rocks too, right? Well, like we covered earlier, the main reasons why Rocks isn't known is because no one wanted to tell his tales, and dead men tell no tales as well. But like I mentioned before, let's go back and look specifically at Rocks and why the reputation that is popularized about how evil and powerful he was may not be true. Let's start from the top. The ambition of their captain, Rocks, was to be king of the world. They opened hostilities against the world government like some kind of terrorist organization. The government itself covered up much of their deeds. At the time, everyone had heard of the threat that they posed. This was due to the fateful event 38 years ago at God Valley. Okay, let's unpack that. From this, we see that the events of God Valley was actually reported. It was due to that event that everyone had heard of the threat that they posed. So though God Valley and its location was deleted, the events that happened were not erased and is the reason why Rocks was known. Again, why even report about Rocks if the island was just going to get deleted afterwards anyways? A question that can be answered in many ways, but going back, it says now the government itself covered up much of their deeds. What were the deeds? They opened hostilities against the world government. Well, that sounds so awful and scary. Oh no, pirates going against the world government. Oh wait, isn't that what all pirates do? Isn't that exactly what Luffy did with the Straw Hat Pirates? Luffy is technically a terrorist for the world government, especially in Sengoku's eyes. He had open hostilities with the world government at Enies Lobby. They blamed Luffy for Enies Lobby burning down when it was their own fault for Buster calling it. And Luffy broke out prisoners from Impel Down as well. Marineford events on top of that, all of these events that they couldn't cover up, but they did want to cover up Crocodile and Moria's defeats, which are still acts against the world government given that those were both reputable warlords. And real quick, let's look at how Crocodile's situation on Arabasta was handled. Luffy took down the world government sanctioned warlord from stirring up a revolution, executing the royal family, and nearly decimating an entire capital city. Allegedly, because Pell survived it. But all of this is great news, right? Except that Crocodile was a world government representative. To cover their own butt cheeks, the Gorosei did not want the news that the pirates liberated a nation, and instead gave Smoker and Tashigi awards and a promotion for being the heroes of Arabasta, which Smoker clearly was not happy about. Doesn't that sound like the situation Garp was in? Smoker can't talk about the truth of Arabasta because it'll go against the Gorosei's orders. Couldn't that also be Garp's situation, that in truth he played a less than heroic role in God Valley, and this situation parallels God Valley's situation? The overall point being that yes, from Sengoku's point of view and his bias, yeah, Rox is evil, but painting him to be a villain from our point of view is odd because you could say this is all about Luffy. If you just replace the names, it's the same story. I mean, when Sengoku says the ambition of their captain, Rox, was to be king of the world, at the time of God Valley, there was no term like the Pirate King. Roger was the first about 18 years later. Whatever Rox was saying could have simply been nearly parallel to what Luffy runs around saying now, but regardless, to paint Rox as an evil person, could that not be the simplest way to do it? To exaggerate and make up his ambitions? To be the world's biggest taboo that Rox apparently wanted to be king of the world, when the world has an 800-year truce to keep the empty throne empty and have no king. Doesn't all of this sound familiar? Wasn't Ohara just researching rocks? I mean, poneglyphs? And the world government said that the demons of Ohara were conspiring to destroy the world? That's the news that was spread immediately, which we know to be a flat out lie. But in order to justify their actions, they made up their own story to fit their agenda, and is that not what we should suspect with the rock situation? Was being king of the world, the ultimate taboo of the world, actually Rox's ambitions? Or was that the way that the world government convinced the nations and the world of this man's evil atrocities? I'd imagine if Luffy was ever taken down, the headline would be something like Monkey D. Luffy, son of the worst criminal Monkey D. Dragon, brother of Ace, demon spawn of Gold Roger, and sworn brother of Sabo the terrorist, conspired to destroy Mary Joie and destroy the world. I mean, right now, they and Morgans are saying Luffy is holding Vegapunk hostage, the world's beloved scientist. At the end of the day, when we are getting our information from the Marines and the news reports, we have to understand that it almost always will be not true, especially if it's about Luffy or a character like Rox, which is why I said I would have trusted Roger's pirates as an information source over anyone else. But to address the last line here about Rox from Sengoku, it's this. Because Rox was so ambitious in his pursuit of being king of the world, and he broke too many of the world's taboos, there is no information in the public record about the Rox pirates. Well, what are the laws of the world? Well, let's look at Ohara. We found out that the taboo is unraveling the mystery of the Void Century. Reading the poneglyphs is a crime, breaking a law from 800 years ago. I imagine touching a celestial dragon or disobeying them could also be considered a world taboo, which might be more related here. But the point being is that regardless, the world's taboos are of no real consequence, but also Luffy's crew dabbles in both, and neither of those things are indicators of strength or notoriety. And because of these activities, there is no information in the public. That doesn't mean that there isn't information about them. And you might be saying, but Rox couldn't possibly read poneglyphs back then. But that's the thing. It's not even reading them that's the crime. On Ohara, they didn't even check if the scholars could read them. Once they found out that they had a poneglyph, it was an instant death sentence, essentially. And on top of that, Roger didn't even need to be able to read them to hear them. With Voice of All Things, he could gather some sort of information which Rox might have also had. But anyways, to summarize a lot of what we covered, Rox was not erased to the same extent that God Valley was. Sengoku entertained no conversation about God Valley, yet divulged as much information as he could about Rox. There was news coverage about Rox at God Valley as well, and there's proof of several Marines even knowing about Rox. It was simply that Rox was lost in history due to the thematic about telling tales of people after their death. The same thing that Kaido chased, but never mentioned Rox for it. Rox was only forgotten because the people who surrounded him chose to forget him, and that theme is reinforced throughout One Piece. In Oda's first note in chapter 1, he even says pirates hardly ever left written records of their history, and that's important because of what Hero Luke said. A man only really dies when they are forgotten, not when they are killed. That's probably what Kaido really meant here, that Roger and Whitebeard were going to be immortalized essentially by the legacy that they left, whereas Rox left no memories worth ever mentioning again, which is why he truly did die within the current story. The tales told by the world are the perspectives that history will remember beyond someone's lifespan and determine how they live in the memories of the future generations. And we see an antithesis to Rox in the Marines, because they came out proud and spoke of the tales of the legendary hero of the Marines, Garp. While God Valley was erased, and probably in the same way as Leloucia, it was not done in the presence of any witnesses, which would imply that the erasure of event took place after the God Valley incident rather than at the end of it. And most importantly, the reputation that Rox garnered and was portrayed to us by Sengoku is inconclusive. He could be as evil as Doflamingo or Blackbeard, or as whimsical and free-spirited as Luffy. We can't say for sure yet. Now, I think the last thing to touch on was Rox strong? The strongest there ever was in modern times, the one who's number one on so many people's top 30s. In chapter 957, the Marines say it's hard to imagine one man leading 3 of the 4 emperors. In Road to Laugh Tale, it says Roger's strongest adversary was Rox, the taboo pirate. But what Sengoku actually says in the manga here is that he was Roger's first foe and perhaps his greatest, which is hilarious, but I'll get to that in a little bit. The contention point that a lot of people have about why they believe Rox to be strong was because he was captain of these monsters, all of which are conquerors. Kaido seemingly not wanting too many conquerors stemming from Rox's crew and how they operated, which indicates that there was some infighting. I mean, that's what it also said in Kaido's flashback, but also what we gather from what Sengoku said in that they never got along. So was Rox really their captain that truly domineered over all of them, or were they all doing their own thing and not actually under his control? I mean, when you say infighting, it's also vague in that Sanji and Zoro fight all the time, but you wouldn't say that they don't have teamwork because they do. So it sounds interesting, and on top of that, Luffy does have control over them, but it doesn't seem like Rox did. That seems to be why they fell apart, so wouldn't that mean he is weak? But then again, it was said to be Roger's greatest foe. But here's the thing, you could be a figurehead of an organization and not be strong. Now you might be starting to understand what I'm getting at here, but before I go on, I want to strongly separate what I'm about to say from what we discussed before this point. The two logic lines can be completely separate or combined, but the next part is simply a different interpretation of chapter 957 that I could see. Yeah, so let's just cut to it. Do you know of an organization where the world's strongest something and a scheming genius pirate who is on the search of an ancient weapon is underneath someone definitely weaker than them? Yes, I'm talking about the Cross Guild. The world's strongest swordsman Mihawk and Crocodile are, for certain circumstances, underneath Buggy, and even the masses within the crew see Buggy as the one above the rest, despite that not being the case at all. In the Rox example, we have the world's strongest man, Whitebeard, and then Shiki, who is set on finding the ancient weapon for Roger. And you're probably wondering about where Kaido and Big Mom fit. Well, let's look at their fusion clone Alvida. I mean, memes aside, Kaido was someone who they brought on much later. And let's talk about the process of getting people onto the crew. Do we know of a process of getting people on your crew regardless of merit? It's all sworn on pirate honor. Yeah, a Davy back fight. And I know this is not a new thought. Plenty have thought Rox pirates could have been heavily tied to Davy back fights. I mean, it's a pretty simple connection given when it was introduced to us, it was said to have originated from Pirate Island, and Rox's headquarters is Pirate Island full of lead. But then, even in this panel supposedly showing Hero of the Marines Garp at God Valley, doesn't this remind you of the ending of the Davy back fight Luffy had? I mean, this would explain how Garp and Roger overcame the strongest pirate crew in existence. If it were through a Davy backfight, I mean, let's talk about the aftermath, right? If your pirate crew was disbanded in a Davy backfight, wouldn't that be super embarrassing? But even worse, let's see what happened at the end of the Davy backfight that Luffy had. After winning, instead of taking a crewmate, he decided to take Foxy's Jolly Roger. And look at the disappointment in his crew. But more importantly, in the rules, it says a stolen flag may never be displayed again. Is that why Rox is never talked about? Ending the rules saying anyone who does not obey these articles goes to Davy Jones's locker as a disgrace to all pirates. That could explain a lot of the similar circumstances that we heard coming out of God Valley. And yes, I know all of this sounds wacky, and you know what else is wacky? A connection someone made is look at the Jolly Roger Luffy donned on his chest during the final boxing match. It's eerily similar to the Rox Pirates Jolly Roger, right? Is it a coincidence that Oda included that random Jolly Roger in a game that Luffy played that originated from Rox's Island? And And the game that we're talking about, the Davy Back fight, would explain exactly how so many crazy strong crewmates found themselves in one place like this, and how they fell apart so quickly. And on top of that, the aftermath being that this is so embarrassing that no one would want to talk about it, including the winner, Garp. Why would this be a victory Garp would ever want to speak about or claim? And again, I know I'm not the first or last one to bring this theory up to you. I'm just emphasizing its validity in considering for the context of chapter 957. It does seem like a very Oda thing to do. And earlier, I laughed when I read it to you, how Sengoku said Rocks was Roger's first foe. I honestly forgot that was ever said. That really confused me because by the time God Valley happened, Roger had already made it to Lodestar. So he basically circumnavigated the globe, but Rocks was still his first foe, which implies that Roger has a long history with Rocks. And remember how I painted a parallel to how Rocks was described by Sengoku to how Luffy would be described? But we know that Roger and Luffy have direct parallels, especially their dreams, right? So it's kind of like Rocks and Rogers combined to make Luffy. But also, if you kind of think about it, who was Luffy's first foe? You get a good laugh when you really think about it. So yeah, Luffy has had a lot of antagonists, but there's always been a reason to fight them outside of himself. Like Moria was Luffy's foe because he ran directly in front of Luffy and his crew, whereas Crocodile was an antagonist that Luffy fought because he was Vivi's friend and that was his friend's foe. I know that sounds like splitting hairs, but Arlong, Captain Kuro would be Nami and Usopp's foe. In the same way that Axe-Hand Morgan was Zoro's foe and Alvida was technically Kobe's foe, not Luffy's. And in that perspective, the first real foe Luffy had was actually Buggy. Buggy was the first antagonist that Luffy told his goal to become a pirate king, in which Buggy responded saying he'd be pirate god. And on top of that, he had personal ties to Buggy, and he was also the only person to ever damage Luffy's straw hat, his treasure. Imagine if this is how Roger and Rocks met too. Very early on, Rocks and Roger met as foes, and then years later, Rocks continued to fall upwards like Buggy and eventually created another confliction point much later on in their journeys, like we are currently seeing with Buggy and Luffy. Buggy is now technically the figurehead of two of the strongest pirates in the entire ocean, and a bunch of others with crazy epithets, and an organization with an insane reverence for Buggy. I mean, let's look at how someone without first-hand knowledge of any of the members regard this situation. Law says that Buggy deserves to be called an emperor because of the men underneath him. That could easily be the way the world viewed Rocks, and honestly rightfully so. If I just heard of a man commanding Whitebeard, Big Mom, Kaido, Shiki, and several other world-renowned criminals on that level, I would 100% assume that they are terrifying, just like we do about Rocks. But that's because we don't have the context, and with the context, that same description of a person could just be Buggy, which is the incredible troll that we should expect of Oda. I know the community for some reason hates being trolled, but comes to love One Piece at the same time, but forget that by far the biggest troll in the entire community is Oda himself. I mean, I think I come a close second saying Big Mom was Kaido's real right hand over King, but if you don't know that joke, then you just have to watch more of my shorts and streams. And talking about trolls, let's talk about how troll, but awesome, but still very troll, the entire Cross Guild development was. I mean, most of the community felt trolled hearing that Buggy was the fourth emperor, but probably had a heart attack to find out that the reason why is because he had Crocodile and Mihawk, some of the community's favorite antagonists, underneath him. And what's even more so, many have now theorized that the Cross Guild is going to be the organization that brings back Davy Back fights against the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, so we might have the full parallel loop around here. But finally, let's address the elephant in the room. You're probably thinking, Par, all that's great, but you painting Rocks in this light where he is a fraud and not this scary, terrifying monster is really disingenuous. Why did Kaido have Rocks in his top 5 strongest people along with Whitebeard, Roger, Odin, and Shanks? And my answer to that is that's the beauty of an illusion. When Buggy had a bunch of impaled down prisoners in his vicinity, many of them could have been stronger than him, even with higher bounties. The higher up that pedestal became, where Buggy as a warlord was able to employ Hirudin, a bona fide giant warrior pirate captain, who also could have probably beat Buggy, I wonder why he was beneath Buggy or even how he views Buggy. When Ace fought Whitebeard's crew, he was met with an underling. in Jinbei, who clashed with him on behalf of Whitebeard. We see that when Kaido was recruited, guess who met him first? It was Whitebeard. It could easily be that no one ever experienced rocks firsthand. So do I think Kaido didn't know how strong rocks was? Well, he had observation haki, and this is where my bias comes in. I think Buggy can be strong. I mean, I have 2 videos that explain some very hidden secrets that Oda may be hiding for Buggy's future role in the story. While he will always be a troll character, he ends up having moments of greatness, kind of like Usopp, that propel them forward. I mean, how many people can say they survived Mihawk's blade? Not that many. But we know that the truth of why Buggy can do that. But to the world, Buggy is the great pirate who survived Mihawk's, the world's strongest swordsman's unrestrained onslaught of sword slashes. And let's not forget this amazing parallel in chapter 549. Through Buggy's amazing fortune, his reputation is presented to all of the impaled down prisoners and shocked them, like literally starstruck them. Buggy realizes very quickly he can ride the momentum of his rising stock to become a Yonko, which we know he did. And then he even thought he could become the Pirate King. All of the underlings having higher bounties than himself, he saw the window where he could leverage this power. Let's hear the speech that Buggy gave. "Be quiet, you bunch of morons," talking down to a bunch of people who are above him. But he goes on, "Are you all out of your minds? There's no stopping this ship anymore. We're heading for the center of this war. We've already come this far. Calm down and think. We could reach out and touch the pinnacle of this world. A chance like this won't come around again. If you're a man, come with me and chase my dream. Today I'll take Whitebeard's head, and with it, the whole world." Again, this is a man that we know has no claim to the throne, yet he let his reputation precede him, and he goes on to say that he wants to take over the world. Isn't that the same thing that Sengoku accused Rocks of? Are we not getting an example of how Rocks could have just operated like Buggy? And discussing one last quick point about portrayal. I do find it incredibly odd that when Whitebeard sat down with Roger and discussed the Will of D in the last conversations with each other, Whitebeard never even mentions Rocks in the context of the D-Clan. Was Rocks actually that insignificant that Teach's connection to the D-Clan was more important in Whitebeard's memory? And really quickly though, I don't want to address Blackbeard in this video, but I want to acknowledge that yeah, just like the parallels I painted with Buggy, you could do the same in what seems to be Blackbeard's dollar store version of the Rocks crew. But the way I'm seeing it right now is that Buggy is Rocks' history repeating, whereas Blackbeard is the spawn of what Rocks' reputation touted him to be. They would be 2 sides of the coin where Buggy is the truth of the situation and Blackbeard was what Rocks sounded like he would be. And in a lot of ways, Blackbeard's crew could be the Rocks crew reversed, where in Blackbeard's crew, he is the absurdly strong one and his crew is competent but not Yonko level, whereas in the Rocks crew, the captain could have been a man of empty bluffs like Buggy and his crew were all literally Yonko level. The entire point of this video wasn't to convince you that you're wrong about Rocks, or that Rocks will be weak. No, it was entirely to open up people's expectations of Rocks, because if they get blindsided by the troll potential laid out here in the story and Oda's reputation, I can easily see this becoming an extremely disappointing moment of the story, when in reality Oda left the canvas for Rocks extremely vague, and on top of everything else, we see how many times reputation precedes the person. Many times the tales of someone we have yet to meet are proven to be exaggerated depictions that people accept because they lack the context of the true history that surrounds that situation. Much like the Void Century, this is a thematic that Oda is highlighting throughout the entire story of One Piece. Like with what we see with Sengoku and Suru's depictions within Bartholomew's imagination, or Jinbei describing Kuma, and ultimately how Sengoku describes Rocks. We see an overly sinister image when the truth might not even be remotely close to that. And I think this is a huge moral of the story. History is written based on the perception of someone's interpretation of a situation, and every person interprets the world differently. Hiding history cripples our understanding of essentially ourselves and even our futures. With all that being said, I know the reputations of my crazy ideas and future videos may have the same effect, but I hope my videos and theories end up connecting you with that smile or excitement that I get when I make these videos or read One Piece. And if you want to support the vision that makes you listen, comment with your ideas, like and share this video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, join the Discord to be a part of the community that gets notified about my live streams where we have so much fun. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next Parvision.